The tariffs that are being imposed on China are going to backfire on the United States. At least that's my estimation. Primarily because when it comes, for instance, to electric vehicles, but also other products, the Chinese price-cost margins are such that Chinese exporters can absorb the tariff and compensate for the loss of revenues by increasing the quantity of products, of the commodities that will be shipped to the west coast of the United States. So there will be, I believe, at least there is a high probability that there will be a perverse effect. The tariffs go on top of the price goes up of Chinese commodities in the United States, but the trade deficit of the United States is going to increase because a lot more will be sent from China to the United States so that the Chinese firms, companies, can make enough money to justify the exports. Meanwhile, the American consumers are going to be paying a lot more for things that don't really have competitors in the United States. Because the thing to remember about the United States is that it has deindustrialized over the last 20, 30 years of globalization, of what goes under the edict of so-called neoliberalism. And no tariffs can, at least in the medium term, bring back the industrial base that the United States has voluntarily given up. Was it not American capital, which after the 1980s, early 1990s, especially during the Clinton administration, essentially shut down its industry in the United States and transported whole industrial sectors to China, intentionally. That was also part of inducing and inducting China into the World Trade Organization. The problem the United States has is that since 2008, there's been precious little investment in the United States. This policy of bailing out Wall Street at all costs, printing as many $1 trillion as were necessary to bail out Wall Street, is a sum of money, just gigantic sum of money, which has essentially been only invested in big tech, in the Silicon Valley, the Amazons and the Ubers and the Airbnbs. Now, if you think about it, this is capital, of course, but it's not productive capital. It is not capital that produces things that people need, that Americans need. So take Amazon. Amazon doesn't make anything. Amazon creates a digital platform in which there's a large amount of production by foreign factories, mainly Asian factories in China, in Vietnam, in India, which is being traded through Amazon. And the larger picture is that in the last 30 years, the United States has chosen not to produce, to deindustrialize. They've chosen that. As we speak, the manufacturing sector of China is twice the size of the American manufacturing sector. A small aside, the Americans have reached a stage where they just can't build anything. Even the famed military-industrial complex, which has ordered a fleet of nuclear submarines, but they can't even produce the nuclear submarines that they have planned to produce. If you travel on American railways, it's like being in a museum. There is a general decline in the capacity to make things in the United States, which was intentional. Because the deal, as they saw it in Washington, since the 1980s, particularly, I'll repeat that, I said this before, the Clinton era, the deal was really simple. So whatever capital was funded through the money minting process in Washington and in New York has essentially been dependent on Chinese manufacturing. So for Janet Yellen to come to China and point a finger and say, oh, you've got too much capacity, it is one of the most delicious jokes in the history of economic diplomacy. The Chinese would produce manufacturing goods en masse. These will be paid for with IOUs, pieces of paper, IOUs, that the Americans would print. They're called dollars, but that's what they are. They're IOUs. The hope and the reality was that these dollars would come to China, to Chinese companies. The Chinese capitalists, what would they do with the dollars? They can't spend them here in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Shenzhen. So they have to take them back to Wall Street to do what with them? To invest them, but not in real investment. The money will have to go, that's what the Americans insist that Chinese savings do, to American bonds. In other words, the Chinese savings or profits are funding the American government, or they will go into, and this is the main game that you must have in your head, into real estate and into assets that produce rent. You're not allowed, Chinese capitalists are not allowed to buy into big tech, into Wall Street, even the Japanese were not allowed to purchase a steel company in the United States. This is the degree of protectionism. This is what they have in mind. In this process of printing lots of IOUs, the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the central bank prints all these dollars, IOUs I call them, right? Because they are the money produced by a deficit country not backed up by production. The only thing that keeps America very strong is the fact that you accept the dollars because the dollar is the only so far serious payment mechanism for anyone in the world. Think about it, it's the only currency in the world that is demanded. The American dollar is the only currency that people want, even if they don't want to buy anything from Americans or go to America. So this is what keeps America strong and allows the Americans to keep printing mountains of dollars, the Fed, to pay for manufacturing goods from China. That doesn't mean that the global setting is satisfactory in any way. And allow me to make a point, as a friend of China, that the sooner the Chinese economy no longer depends on the United States trade deficit to absorb Chinese exports, the sooner China is going to become more independent of the policies of Washington, D.C. and of the European Union. And it is something that I very much look forward to.